Montana winter of 1876. Deep in a snowbound cabin on the mountain. Caleb kneels by the bed, scissors trembling in his hand, eyes red as he stares at the raw wounds cutting into her ribs. His voice breaks, so tight, beside him. Levi presses a warm cloth to her scarred skin, his own eyes wet so soft. Evelyn Vance, a runaway mail-order bride escaping a brutal asylum, never expected these three strangers to be the first men who'd make her tremble from tenderness, not fear. What turns three rugged frontier brothers into men willing to kneel for a broken woman? Hit follow to find out. The stagecoach rattled to a stop, and the door swung open on a gust of cold air that smelled like pine and wet earth. Evelyn Vance stepped down into the mud of Copper Ridge, Montana, and the world tilted sideways for a second before it steadied. She had a certificate folded into a small square in her coat pocket. It named one man, Marcus Hale. It said, a rancher looking for a wife. That was the plan. One husband, one house, one quiet life far from anyone who knew her name. She was not prepared for three. They stood near the general store, apart from the crowd, the way boulders sit apart from gravel. The tallest one had gray at his temples and a doctor's bag at his feet. Beside him stood a leaner man with dark eyes that missed nothing, and next to him, a younger one with sawdust still clinging to his sleeves. Evelyn's hand found the strap of her bag and gripped it hard. The town noise came at her all at once. A hammer against metal somewhere. A dog barking. Men laughing too loud outside the saloon. Each sound landed like a slap, and her chest began to close, the way it always did, the air going thin and useless in her lungs. She was back there, back in the ward, boots on tile, a door slamming shut, someone screaming down the hall, and no one coming to help. Her knees buckled. Evelyn, a voice, low and even, cut through the noise before her body hit the ground. Hands caught her, careful, unhurried, the way you'd catch something breakable, and mean to keep it that way. Don't crowd her. That was Caleb, his voice again. He said it to his brothers, not to her, and the two men behind him stepped back at once. No argument, no hesitation. Evelyn's eyes opened. A face hovered above hers, lined and weathered, watching her the way a man watches a wound he's about to stitch, not with pity, with attention. You're not there anymore, he said. You're here. Cold air, mud, a town that doesn't know your name yet. She heard herself breathing, fast and shallow, and tried to slow it down. My name is Caleb Thorne, he said. I'm a doctor, was a surgeon, before you fainted. That's all. Nothing's broken. There was supposed to be one of you, she whispered. There's three, he said. Plain. No apology in it. Might as well know that now, instead of later. He didn't reach for her hand. He held his out, palm up, and waited. Evelyn looked at that hand for a long moment. Nobody had ever offered her a choice about anything in almost a year. Doors had been locked. Wrists had been held down. Even kindness had come with conditions. This didn't. She took his hand herself, and he let her set the pace, let her rise slow, let her find her own footing in the mud. That's Gideon, Caleb said, nodding toward the leaner man. And Levi, the younger one, gave a small nod, a little awkward, like he wasn't sure a smile would help or hurt. Three brothers, Evelyn said. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. Three, Gideon agreed. One bride. We drew straws once. Didn't help. We're not in the business of splitting a woman three ways, like she's a plot of land. Then what am I here for? Caleb studied her face a moment before he answered. The way a man reads a chart before he says something he means to stand behind. You're here because you answered an advertisement. And we sent it, he said. Whatever happens after that is yours to decide. All of it. Every part. The wind picked up, sharp enough to sting, and Evelyn pulled her collar tighter. She thought of the notebook sewn into the lining of her bag. Black leather, full of names and dates that could still ruin her if the wrong hands found it. She thought of the uncle who'd signed the papers that put her away. She thought of how long it had been since anyone asked what she wanted, instead of telling her what she'd get. The mountain's a hard climb from here, Levi said, breaking the quiet. His voice was lighter than his brother's. Like he'd decided a while back that heaviness wasn't a language he wanted to speak. Wagon can only take us partway. Rest is on foot. I can walk, Evelyn said. Didn't doubt it, Gideon said. She looked past them, up toward the peaks, disappearing into gray cloud, and felt something in her chest ease just slightly. The kind of ease that comes from a threat postponed rather than gone. She didn't know these men. She didn't know if the sanctuary in that offered hand was real, or if it would crack open later like everything else had. But no one had grabbed her. No one had forced her feet to move faster than they could go. All right, she said, and for the first time since the asylum gates had closed behind her escape, she took a step forward on her own power, toward 3 strangers, and a mountain she couldn't see the top of yet. The wagon made it 2 miles before the trail turned to rock, and the driver said this was as far as any wheel would go. After that, it was legs, snow past the ankle, and a wind that came down off the peaks like it had somewhere to be. Evelyn walked as long as she could. She counted her steps at first, the way she used to count ceiling tiles back at the asylum, a trick to keep her mind from wandering somewhere dark. 50 steps, 100. The cold worked its way through her boots and up her legs until she couldn't feel her toes anymore. At step 200 and something, her knees gave out. She didn't fall far. Gideon was there before she hit the ground, one arm scooping under her legs, the other bracing her back. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, which wasn't true, but he made it look that way. Her whole body went rigid. It wasn't him. She knew that. Somewhere underneath the panic, it was the arms. Arms that held you down instead of up. Arms that pinned your wrists to a table while someone forced a needle into your skin. Her muscles locked, and her breath caught somewhere in her throat, and she made a small sound she hated herself for making. Easy, Gideon said. He didn't stop walking. He didn't set her down either, which surprised her, because setting her down would have been the polite thing, the thing that let her save face. Instead, he kept his pace steady and his voice steadier. You can hate this. Just don't fight me on the ice. One of us goes down. We both go down. And then we're both cold and both hurt. Put me down, she managed. Can you walk another mile in this? She didn't answer, because they both knew she couldn't. Then I'm going to keep carrying you, he said, and you're going to keep hating it, and we'll get there anyway. Hating something and getting through it aren't opposites. I've done plenty of both at the same time. That struck her as an odd thing to say, and odd enough that it cut through the panic for a second, gave her something to hold on to besides fear. She made herself breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Caleb had told her to do that back in town, and she hadn't thought she'd use it again so soon. You're stiff as a fence post, Gideon said, not unkindly. Somebody hurt you carrying you before. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. She just nodded, once, her chin barely moving against his shoulder. Figured, he said. I'll tell you when I'm about to change my grip, so it's not a surprise. That work. Why does it matter if it works for me? Because you're not cargo, he said. You're a person who happens to need carrying right now. Big difference. Cargo doesn't get asked. She didn't have an answer for that either, so she just let herself be carried the rest of the way, muscles slowly unlocking one by one as the mountain leveled out, and the trees opened onto a clearing with smoke rising from a chimney. The cabin was bigger than she expected. 2 stories, thick log walls, a porch that ran the length of the front. Warm light spilled from the windows onto the snow. Levi got there first, opening the door before Gideon's boot hit the top step, ushering them both inside out of the wind. Caleb had gone ahead earlier to get the fire going, and the heat inside hit Evelyn like a wall, almost as shocking as the cold had been. Gideon set her down carefully on a chair near the hearth, and she sat there for a moment, just breathing in the warmth, not trusting yet that it was real. You'll want dry clothes, Levi said. He didn't linger on her, didn't stare, just said it plain and matter of fact, the way you'd tell someone the weather. I'll show you your room. Her room, not our room, not the room. She noticed the word and filed it away. He led her down a short hall to a door at the end, and when he opened it, she stopped in the doorway, because it wasn't what she expected at all. It was small, but it was warm, with a fire already lit in a little stone hearth and a bed piled with quilts. There was a chair by the window and a shelf with a few books on it, and a wash basin with steam still rising off the water someone had left in it. And on the inside of the door, at eye level, was a heavy iron lock. She stared at it a long moment. "That's for you," Levi said, watching her look at it. "Not for us. We don't have a key. Never will. Why would I need to lock a door in my own husband's house?" "You don't have a husband yet," Levi said. "You've got 3 men who agreed to marry a stranger. And now that stranger's standing in front of us. And we don't know a thing about what she's been through, except that it was bad enough to make her flinch when Gideon lifted her off the ground. So, lock's yours. Use it every night if you want. Use it never, if you get to where you don't want it. And if I lock it and never come out, then we'll bring supper to the door and knock twice and leave," he said, "and do that again tomorrow, and the day after." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And Levi seemed to understand that silence was its own kind of answer. "Get changed," he said. "Warm yourself. Come out when you're ready. Or don't. Either way, nobody's crossing this threshold unless you're the one who opens the door." He stepped back into the hall and pulled the door most of the way shut, leaving her alone with the fire and the lock and more privacy than she'd had in 11 months. She crossed the room slowly, ran her fingers along the iron of the lock, testing that it was real, that it would actually hold. She turned it. The bolt slid home with a solid, satisfying click. For the first time since the night her uncle's men had dragged her out of her own house, Evelyn Vance sat down on a soft bed, behind a locked door of her own choosing, and let herself cry without anyone watching. She didn't come out for supper that first night. She heard the knock. Twice, just like Levi said, and a tray was left outside her door. And the footsteps retreated without waiting for a response. She ate alone, sitting cross-legged on the quilt, and it was the best meal she could remember having in a year. Later, once the fire had burned low and the cabin outside had gone quiet, she pressed her ear to the door and listened. She heard low voices from the other room. Not arguing, talking. "She's been through hell," she heard Caleb say. Whatever hell it was, it left marks. She locked the door. Levi said, "Good. That's what it's there for. She's got grit," Gideon said. Carried herself 200 steps through snow that would have put most men on their backs. Didn't complain once until her body quit on her. "Grit and fear aren't opposites," Caleb said. "Woman can have both." Evelyn stepped back from the door, her hand pressed flat against her chest, and, for the first time, in longer than she could remember, what she heard in that quiet talk wasn't a threat. It was 3 men trying to figure out how not to hurt her. She slept that night without a single nightmare, and woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee drifting faint under her door, and the lock still turned, exactly where she'd left it. The fever came on the 3rd night, sudden and mean. Evelyn had been managing well enough during the days, coming out for meals, sitting near the fire while the brothers went about their chores, saying little but watching everything. She'd started to believe the worst of it was behind her. Then her body betrayed that belief entirely. It started as a chill she couldn't shake, even sitting near the hearth. By supper time, she was shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. And by the time Levi noticed, her face had gone the color of ash. She could barely hold her own head up. "Caleb," he called, sharp enough that his brother came running from the other room. Caleb took one look at her and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, then her neck. "She's burning up," he said. "Get her to the bed." Now they carried her between them, Gideon supporting her legs, Levi her shoulders, moving fast but careful, the panic in their movements controlled instead of wild. Evelyn's mind had gone somewhere hazy and far off, thoughts sliding past too quick to catch. "Evelyn, Evelyn, look at me," Caleb's voice, steady, cutting through the fog. "I need to see what's under your dress, under the bindings you're wearing." "Can you hear me?" She heard him. She understood the words, but her body wasn't listening to her anymore. And when his hands moved toward the buttons at her collar, every muscle in her seized up at once, the way it had seized when Gideon lifted her on the trail. Except tenfold. Except total. No, she managed, though it came out as barely a breath. I know, Caleb said. I know you don't want hands on you right now. I'm sorry. I don't have a choice. And neither do you. Not this time. You're burning from the inside, and I think I know why. He was right to think it. Beneath her dress, wound tight around her ribs, were the remnants of the restraints they'd used on her at the asylum. An old canvas binding meant to keep her arms pinned that she'd never fully removed. Not properly. Not with the kind of care it required. She'd hidden the damage under layers of clothing since the day she escaped. Too afraid of what anyone would think. Too afraid of what they'd see. Now infection had taken hold, and there was no hiding it anymore. Gideon and Levi held the lamp steady and stayed near enough to help but far enough to give Caleb room to work. And neither of them said a word as he cut away her dress with careful scissors, working around her, never touching skin he didn't have to. What he found beneath made his jaw go tight. Old lacerations. Some healed wrong. Some never healed at all. Crisscrossed her ribs, where the canvas straps had cut in during whatever night she'd fought against them hardest. The skin around several wounds had gone red and swollen, hot to the touch, weeping in places it shouldn't have been. Christ, Gideon said under his breath. Not now, Caleb said. Not sharp, just focused. Levi, more hot water. Clean cloth. Gideon, hold her hands. Gentle. Just so she doesn't thrash and tear something worse while I'm cutting. Gideon knelt beside the bed and took her hands in his. And Evelyn's whole body fought it for one long second before something in her seemed to recognize his voice, low and even, the same voice that had carried her up the mountain. I've got you, he murmured. Just your hands. Nothing more. The scissors moved slow through the canvas, snip by snip, Caleb's fingers steady, even as his face had gone pale at what he was uncovering. The bindings had been on so long, wounds so tight, that they'd fused in places to the healing skin beneath. And freeing her from them meant working with a patience that made the whole room hold its breath. So tight, Caleb murmured, almost to himself, his voice breaking somewhere in the middle of the words. He wasn't talking to anyone in the room. He was talking to the ghost of whoever had wound these straps around a young woman's ribs and left her like this, so damn tight. The last of the canvas fell away, and Evelyn's breath came out in a long, shuddering rush, like her lungs had finally been given room to fill all the way for the first time in months. Levi arrived with the basin and cloth, and where Caleb's hands had been surgeon's hands, quick and precise, Levi's were slower. He dipped the cloth in warm water and pressed it, gentle, to the worst of the wounds, cleaning away the blood and the grime of a healing that had never been allowed to happen properly. So soft, he said, quiet, almost surprised by it, as his thumb brushed a tear that had slipped free down her cheek, wiping it away before it could fall further. He wasn't talking about the wound. He was talking about her, about the fragile thing they'd found underneath everything the world had done to try and harden her. Evelyn trembled. It wasn't the trembling she'd expected to feel around three strange men, the kind born of fear, the kind that made her want to run and hide behind a locked door. This was different. This came from somewhere she didn't have a name for yet. A shaking that came from being touched with more gentleness than cruelty in the same hour. More care than she'd been shown in longer than she could remember. The fire in the hearth threw the men's shadows huge against the log walls. Three giants looming tall and dark. But as they leaned in close to tend her, as Caleb worked the last of the infection clean, and Levi laid cool cloths against her fevered skin, and Gideon held her hands like something precious, instead of something to be restrained. Those towering shadows folded down small, kneeling, bent low over the bed like men at prayer. Stay with us, Caleb said, his voice rough. Stay right here. You're safe. Nobody's tying you down again. Not while there's breath in any of the three of us. She didn't remember falling asleep. She remembered the warmth of the fire and the low murmur of three voices taking turns through the night, checking her temperature, changing her cloths, never once raising a hand that wasn't gentle. By morning, the fever had broken. She woke to daylight and the smell of broth cooking somewhere nearby. And for a long while, she just lay still, taking stock of her own body, of the clean bandages wrapped careful around her ribs, of the fact that she was alive, and that 3 men she barely knew had spent the whole night making sure of it. Caleb came in not long after, carrying a bowl of broth and a look on his face like a man bracing for something. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Alive," she said, which I wasn't sure about. "Around midnight. You had us worried." He set the bowl down and helped her sit up, slow, careful of the bandages. "I should have looked you over the first night. I let you keep your privacy, and it nearly cost you your life. I'm sorry for that. You didn't do this to me," she said. "The asylum did. You just found it. Found it too late. You found it in time," she corrected. "That matters more." He studied her a long moment, the same way he had back in town, reading her like something that needed careful handling. "You showed us something last night," he said, "not just the scars. The trust it took to let us see them. That's not nothing, Evelyn. Most folks would have fought us to the last breath rather than let 3 strange men see them that hurt." "I did fight," she said, "for a minute. And then you stopped," Caleb said. "That's the part that matters." By the second week, Evelyn had grown restless in a way that surprised her. The fever was gone, the wounds healing clean under Caleb's care, and her strength had returned enough that sitting idle by the hearth all day had started to feel less like recovery and more like being caged, however gently. She'd spent enough of her life confined to know the difference between rest and captivity, even when the captivity came wrapped in kindness. She found Gideon out back one morning, cleaning a rifle on the porch steps, and she watched him work for a while before she spoke. "Teach me to shoot," she said. He didn't look up right away. He finished wiping down the barrel, set it aside, and only then met her eyes. "Why?" "Because a man came for me once with legal papers and a smile, and I had nothing to stop him with but running," she said. "I don't intend to run again." Something shifted in Gideon's face, something like respect, settling into the lines of it. "Caleb, no, you're asking me this. Caleb isn't the one holding the rifle." That earned a short laugh, quick and surprised out of him. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've got." They walked out to a snowy ridge behind the cabin where he'd set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log, the mountains rising pale and silent all around them. He handed her the rifle, showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to breathe out slow before she squeezed the trigger instead of yanking it. Her first shot went wide into the trees. Her second missed by less. By the fifth, she'd clipped the edge of a can and sent it spinning off the log, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of it. "Good," Gideon said. Again, he stood close behind her to correct her stance, his hands guiding her elbow, her shoulder, never lingering longer than the correction required. His breath came out in white clouds in the cold air, and behind her, she could feel the steady thump of his heartbeat against her back, where he stood close to adjust her aim. Calm and even. Nothing like the frantic pulse of fear she'd expected to feel from a man standing this near. "You're not scared of me anymore," he said, somewhere in the middle of the lesson. "I'm working on it." "Working on it's more than most people manage," he said. "Took me years to stop being scared of what this town thought of me, and I never did fully manage it. Half the folks down there still look at me like I don't belong in my own skin. My mother's people, my father's people. Neither side ever fully claimed me as theirs. How do you live with that? You stop asking them to claim you," he said. "You claim yourself instead, same as you're doing right now. Learning to hold a gun in your own 2 hands instead of waiting on someone else to protect you." She thought about that as she lined up another shot, about the years she'd spent handled by doctors and orderlies, and an uncle who saw her only as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person with a say in her own life. "Nobody ever asked me what I wanted before," she said. "Not once. Not what I wanted to eat. Not what I wanted to wear. Not whether I wanted their hands on me. Everything was decided, and I was just expected to endure it." "Not here," Gideon said. "Not with us. Whatever you want. It's yours to say. Whatever you don't want, that's yours too. And you don't owe an explanation for either one." And if what I want changes. If I want something today I didn't want yesterday, then it changes, he said. Simple as that. You're not a contract. Evelyn, you're a person. People aren't required to stay fixed in one shape to be worth caring for. She fired again, and this time the can leapt clean off the log, spinning into the snow. There it is, Gideon said, something warm creeping into his voice. She lowered the rifle, breathing hard, more from the tightness in her chest easing than from any exertion. I want to keep this, she said. The rifle, not locked away somewhere for safekeeping, in my room, where I can reach it. It's yours, he said, and he meant it plain. No hesitation. No question of whether a woman ought to have such a thing in her own hands. Your body, your defense, both belong to you. Always have. Only difference now is you've got the means to back that up. She looked out over the ridge at the mountains, white and endless under a hard blue sky. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt something that wasn't fear and wasn't grief, but sat somewhere new and unfamiliar in between the two. She felt like a woman standing on her own 2 feet, rifle in hand, deciding for herself what came next. The wind changed sometime in the 3rd week, and with it came a sound that undid all the progress Evelyn thought she'd made. It started low, a thin whistle through the gaps in the log walls, barely noticeable at first. But as the night wore on and the wind picked up strength, that whistle turned into something closer to a wail, rising and falling, in a rhythm that Evelyn's body recognized before her mind caught up to why. She was back in the ward, not all at once, not the way the panic had taken her in town, but slow creeping. The sound outside braiding itself with a memory she'd spent months trying to bury. The screaming down the hall. The woman 3 doors down who used to wail through the small hours of the night, every night, until the orderlies came with something in a needle to quiet her. The sound never fully stopped. It just got smaller, thinner, worn down into something that still echoed even after they'd hauled her away. Evelyn sat bolt upright in bed, her hands pressed over her ears, rocking slightly, unable to tell the difference anymore between wind and memory. Levi found her like that a little before midnight, having come to check the fire in her room and finding the door unlocked, which alone told him something wasn't right, because she'd taken to locking it faithfully every night since her first. Evelyn, she didn't answer. Her eyes were open, but they weren't seeing him, weren't seeing the room at all. He didn't touch her. He crouched down near the bed, keeping his distance, and started talking, low and even, filling the space with his own voice instead of reaching for her. That's wind, he said. Just wind. Comes down off the peak this time of year. Finds every gap in these old logs and makes a sound like it's got something to say. I've heard grown men swear this cabin was haunted the first time they stayed a night in a storm. Slowly, her eyes found him. Her hands came down from her ears, trembling. It sounds like screaming, she whispered. I believe you, he said. Doesn't make it less real just because it's only wind. Fear doesn't care what's actually causing it. It just answers the alarm. I thought I was past this. You're not past anything, Levi said. You're getting through it. Different thing entirely. Nobody gets past what happened to you. They just find better ways to carry it. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. And for a while, neither of them said anything. Just sat with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling low in the hearth. I can't sleep with that sound, she admitted eventually. Every night it starts up. I'm back there, behind that door, listening. Levi was quiet a moment, turning something over in his mind. Then we'll do something about the sound, he said. You can't stop the wind. No, he agreed. But I can stop what it does once it gets inside these walls. He didn't explain further that night. He just sat with her until her breathing evened out and the worst of the panic passed. And then he left her to sleep, though sleep didn't come easy. Not with that wail still threading through the logs. The next morning, he was gone before breakfast, and gone most of the day after that too. And when Evelyn asked Caleb where he'd disappeared to, all Caleb offered was a small, knowing smile and the words, give him time. He's building something. It took the better part of a week. Levi worked mostly at night. After supper, when the rest of the cabin had gone quiet and Evelyn had retreated to her room. She heard him some evenings through the wall, a soft, rhythmic scraping sound, wood against wood, steady and unhurried. She'd expected it to bother her, another strange sound in a house full of unfamiliar noise. Instead, she found herself listening for it, drawn to the pattern of it, the way it never sped up or faltered, just moved along at its own patient pace, like a heartbeat. One night, she asked him about it through the cracked door. "Come see," he said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she followed a man's voice without hesitation, curiosity winning out over caution. He'd set up a small workshop in the back room off the kitchen, shavings curling across the floor, the smell of fresh-cut pine thick in the air. In his hands, he held a long plane, running it slow, and even down the length of a board clamped to his workbench, the blade peeling back a thin, curling ribbon of wood with each pass. "This," she said. "This is the sound. Been at it a few nights now," he said. Didn't want to say what I was building till it was done. Figured it'd mean more that way. "What are you building?" "Come see that too, once it's finished," he said. Should be done within the week. She found herself returning to that back room most nights after that, not to help, since she knew nothing of carpentry, but simply to sit in the corner on an overturned crate and watch him work. He didn't fill the silence with talk the way some men might have, uncomfortable with quiet. He let the sound of the plane and the smell of the wood speak for him, and somewhere in that rhythm, Evelyn found something close to peace. "You never asked me about the asylum," she said one night, watching him measure a board with careful, patient hands. "Figured you'd tell me what you wanted told when you wanted to tell it," he said. "Not my place to go digging for it. Caleb asks." Gently, but he asks. "Caleb's a healer," Levi said. "Healing means understanding the wound first. I'm not fixing your body. I'm just trying to build you a place where the wind can't reach in and remind you of it. And Gideon's teaching you to stand on your own 2 feet," Levi said. "Different kind of gift entirely. We're not all giving you the same thing, Evelyn. Wouldn't make sense if we did. You didn't need 3 of the same man. You needed 3 different kinds of care. So between us, you'd have all of them covered." She thought about that for a long while after, about how strange and yet how right it felt. This arrangement she'd never asked for and never expected to want. The room was finished 6 days later. Levi led her back to her bedroom that evening, and she noticed immediately that the walls looked different, thicker somehow, the wood grain replaced by something softer to the eye. When she ran her hand along the surface, she found it wasn't wood at all anymore, at least not bare wood. He'd lined the entire room in thick leather, stretched and fitted seamless along every wall. And beneath that, she could feel a layer of something dense and soft, sheep's wool packed tight to muffle the space. "Try it," he said. "Close the door." She did. The silence that fell was immediate and complete. She could no longer hear the wind at all, not even a whisper of it, not even the faint howling that had been a constant undercurrent to every night since she'd arrived. The room had gone utterly, blessedly quiet, save for the crackle of her own fire. How she started, and found she didn't have words for the rest of the question. "Wool holds sound the way a blanket holds heat," Levi said. "Learned that trick from an old builder back east who worked on concert halls. Wanted to keep outside noise from ruining a performance. Figured if it could keep a symphony hall quiet, it could keep a mountain wind quiet too. You did all this so I could sleep. I did all this so you could stop reliving something that's already over," he said. "Sleep's just what happens once it's taken care of." Evelyn sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the leather-lined wall beside her, feeling the complete absence of sound press in around her like something solid and safe. "Nobody's ever built me anything before," she said. "Not like this, not with me in mind." "Then it's about time somebody started," Levi said, and left her to the quiet he'd built her, closing the door soft behind him. That night, for the first time since arriving on the mountain, Evelyn slept a full 8 hours without waking once, without the wind finding its way into her dreams, without the ghost of a screaming ward following her into sleep. She woke the next morning with a clarity she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, and she found herself walking straight to Caleb's room before breakfast, the black leather notebook clutched tight in her hands. He was surprised to see her there, at that hour, with that look on her face. "I need to show you something," she said. "I need someone to know, in case Sterling ever finds me again, in case something happens to me before I can use it myself." She set the notebook down on his desk and opened it to the first page, and Caleb's expression shifted as he began to read, the color draining slowly from his face at what the ledger inside revealed. "This is evidence," he said quietly. "Names, dates, money moved that shouldn't have been moved. Every patient he had wrongly committed," Evelyn said. "Every family he blackmailed to keep quiet. Every dollar my uncle paid him to keep me locked away and declared unfit to inherit anything." Caleb looked up at her, something fierce and protective settling into his features. "Why show me this now?" "Because a week ago, I couldn't have shown it to anyone," she said. "I was still too afraid of what it meant to trust someone with the truth. But you built me a place to heal. And Gideon put a gun in my hands and told me my safety was mine to claim. And Levi built me 4 walls where I could finally sleep through a night without waking up screaming. I trust the 3 of you now, all the way through." Caleb closed the notebook carefully, like something sacred, and set his hand over hers on the desk. "Then we'll keep it safe," he said. "Same as we're keeping you." The blizzard announced itself 3 days later. First as a strange stillness in the air that made the birds go quiet and the animals restless in the barn, and then as a wall of gray cloud rolling in over the western peaks that Gideon watched with a grim, knowing expression. "Worst one I've seen in years," he said, standing on the porch with Caleb beside him. Both men studying the sky like it was an enemy they recognized from an old fight. "We need the woodpile doubled and every animal in the barn secured before nightfall." The whole cabin shifted into motion. Levi reinforced the shutters on every window. Caleb went through his medical stores, checking supplies, since a storm like this one could trap them for days, maybe longer. Evelyn, no longer content to sit idle while the men worked, hauled firewood alongside Levi, her arms full each trip, refusing his offer to spare her the effort. "I'm not made of glass," she told him, when he tried for the second time to take a load from her arms. "I've spent enough of my life being handled like I might break. I'd rather be tired and useful." He let her carry the wood after that, without argument, though she caught him watching, to make sure she didn't overtax herself, a habit she'd come to recognize as simply who he was, rather than a doubt in her capability. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up to a low, constant roar, and the first flakes had begun to fall, thick and fast, promising to bury the mountain by morning. Down in the town below, in the warmth of the sheriff's office, Dr. Sterling had arrived that same afternoon with 2 hired men and a stack of papers he claimed were legal warrants. "The woman is a danger to herself and others," Sterling told the sheriff, a heavyset man named Boone, who looked less than convinced by the theatrical concern in Sterling's voice. "Escaped my care in a violent episode. I have documentation of her condition, sworn statements from staff, and you tracked her all the way out here," Boone said, unimpressed. "A man doesn't travel this far for a patient who doesn't matter," Sterling said, smooth as oil. "She stole property of significant value from my facility on her way out. I mean to recover both the woman and what she took." Boone had heard enough men talk in that particular tone before, the tone of someone who thought his paperwork made him righteous, and he didn't much care for it. But paperwork was paperwork, and a warrant was a warrant, whatever his gut told him about the man holding it. "Storm's coming in bad," Boone said. "You'd be smart to wait it out here." "I've waited long enough," Sterling said. "She's up that mountain, at the Thorn place, if my information's correct. I intend to have her back before this storm makes travel impossible for a month." Boone eyed the darkening sky outside his window and shook his head slow. "Your funeral," he muttered, though he agreed, reluctantly, to guide them partway, if only to keep 3 fool men from getting lost and freezing to death on his watch. They rode out just as the first heavy bands of snow began to fall, and within an hour, the storm had swallowed the trail behind them entirely. Back at the cabin, Evelyn stood at her window, watching the snow come down in sheets so thick she couldn't see the tree line anymore. And something old and familiar stirred uneasy in her stomach, a feeling she'd learned not to ignore. Something's wrong, she told Caleb at supper. I can't explain it. I just feel it. Storms make everyone uneasy, Caleb said, though his own eyes kept drifting to the shuttered windows more often than usual. It's not the storm, she said. It's him. I know it doesn't make sense, but I know it the same way. I knew the fever was coming before it hit. Gideon set down his fork, his expression turning serious. You've survived a man who hunts people for a living, he said. That kind of instinct doesn't lie just because it's inconvenient. If you feel it, we listen to it. They doubled the locks on the doors that night, checked the rifles, kept the lamps burning low but steady in every room. Evelyn didn't sleep, not really, just drifted in and out, listening to the storm howl against her soundproofed walls. Though even Levi's careful craftsmanship couldn't fully silence a blizzard of this size. It was well past midnight when the pounding started at the front door. Three men's fists hammering against the wood, voices shouting over the wind, half frozen and desperate. Please, we need shelter. We're lost in the storm. Please, God, open the door. Caleb, Gideon, and Levi exchanged a single, silent look, and in that look passed an entire conversation. They had no way of knowing who stood on the other side of that door, but leaving any man to die in a storm like this one, whoever he was, wasn't something any of them could stomach, not even if instinct whispered danger. Evelyn, Caleb said, turning to her fast, his voice low and urgent. Go to the cellar. Now, whoever's out there. We don't know yet if it's trouble or just fools caught in bad weather, but your instincts have been right about everything else. I'm not taking chances with your safety. She didn't argue. She'd learned, over these past weeks, that there was a difference between blind obedience and trusting people who'd earned it. And this, she decided in an instant, was the latter. Levi guided her fast to the concealed trapdoor beneath the kitchen floorboards, a root cellar he'd built with his own hands months before she'd ever arrived. Meant originally for storing vegetables through the winter, but reinforced, she now realized, with far more care than mere vegetables required. Stay quiet, he whispered, helping her down into the dark, narrow space. Whatever you hear up there, however long it takes, stay quiet and stay still. We'll come for you the second it's safe. The trapdoor closed above her, and she was plunged into total darkness. The muffled sound of boots and voices filtering down faint through the floorboards. And for the second time in her life, Evelyn found herself hiding in the dark, waiting to learn whether the world above her meant to save her or destroy her. The door opened, and three men stumbled in half-frozen, snow-caked thick on their coats, faces raw and red from the wind. Evelyn, crouched in the dark below the floorboards, recognized the second voice before she recognized the words, and every muscle in her body went rigid at once. Dr. Sterling. Much obliged, Sterling was saying, his voice smooth even through chattering teeth. The same practiced charm she remembered from every visit he'd made to the ward. Right before he ordered something cruel done to whichever patient had displeased him that day. We were sure we'd freeze to death out there. Storm caught us faster than we figured, said one of the hired men, stamping snow off his boots. Caleb's voice answered, even and hospitable, giving nothing away. Anyone would have done the same. Come in by the fire. Warm yourselves. We've got stew on if you're hungry. Evelyn pressed her hand flat over her own mouth, forcing her breathing slow and silent, listening to the floorboards creak above her as Sterling's boots crossed the very room where she'd eaten breakfast that morning. Three brothers, Sterling was saying, conversational, probing, bachelors, out here, alone, unusual for a place this well kept. Not so unusual in these parts, Gideon said, his voice cool, giving no hint of the tension Evelyn knew must be coiled tight beneath his calm. Man builds a life wherever the land lets him. We manage well enough. No women in the house, Sterling pressed, There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before Levi answered. Just the three of us. Evelyn heard the lie land smooth and unbothered, and something in her chest eased slightly, grateful and terrified all at once, at how easily they protected her, at how much danger they were inviting, simply by doing so. Sterling settled by the fire, and for a long while the conversation stayed idle. Storm talk, town gossip, the kind of empty chatter men made to fill silence while they sized each other up. But Evelyn could hear the careful edge beneath every answer her three men gave. Could hear how each of them steered the conversation away from anything that might lead Sterling closer to the truth. Above her, she heard Caleb move about the kitchen, ladling stew, his footsteps deliberate and unhurried, though she suspected his hand stayed near the pistol. She knew he kept holstered beneath his coat. "You're a doctor," you said, Caleb asked Sterling at one point, his tone carefully curious. "Nothing more. I run a facility back east," Sterling said. "Care for the mentally afflicted. A difficult calling, but a necessary one. Society needs men willing to manage what it cannot manage itself." "Sounds like important work," Caleb said. And Evelyn, crouched in the dark below, could hear the effort it cost him to keep his voice level, to keep from letting even a flicker of the rage she knew he must feel slip into his tone. "I'm actually out here searching for a patient," Sterling continued, "a young woman. Escaped my care some months back in a violent episode. Dangerous, deeply disturbed. I have warrants for her return. Should you happen to encounter her in your travels, we'll keep an eye out," Gideon said, flat and unreadable. "She's clever," Sterling added, and something in his voice sharpened. "Hungry, hunting, manipulative. Might present herself as an innocent. Might spin some tale of mistreatment to win sympathy. I'd advise against believing anything such a woman might tell you." Evelyn's hands curled into fists in the darkness. Fury and fear tangled together so tight she could barely tell them apart. "We're not in the habit of taking strangers at their word, whoever they claim to be," Caleb said, his tone giving nothing away. Though Evelyn thought she heard something dangerous, coiled just beneath the calm surface of it. Man or woman, the night stretched on, agonizing. Every minute, another test of nerve for the men above her, and for Evelyn, crouched silent in the cold dark below. She heard Sterling's boots pace the floor directly above her hiding place more than once, close enough that she held her breath entirely, terrified even the smallest exhale might betray her. Somewhere past 3 in the morning, when Sterling and his men had finally settled by the fire to sleep, exhausted from the storm, Evelyn heard the soft creak of the trapdoor lifting above her, and Levi's face appeared, lit dim by a single shielded candle. "You're all right," he whispered, more statement than question, though relief flooded his features at the sight of her. "I heard everything," she whispered back. "He's still hunting me. He hasn't stopped. He won't find you," Levi said. "Not tonight. Not while any of us are breathing." "How long until the storm breaks?" "Could be tomorrow. Could be 3 more days," he admitted. "We're trapped here with him until it does." Evelyn looked up at him, at the exhaustion and fierce protectiveness warring in his face, and felt something steady settle over her, despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "Then we wait," she said. "And we don't give him what he came for. Not without a fight," Levi agreed, "and not without you having the final say in how that fight ends. Same as everything else." He lowered the candle and closed the trapdoor soft above her once more, and Evelyn settled back into the dark, listening to the storm rage on outside, to the quiet breathing of the man who had once tried to break her sleeping just above her head, and found, to her own surprise, that beneath the fear, something else had begun to take root. She was no longer only the woman hiding in the dark. She was a woman who had learned to shoot, who had trusted 3 strangers with the truth, who had a rifle within reach and a notebook full of evidence that could end her tormentor for good. Whatever came once the storm broke, she intended to meet it standing, not cowering. And for the first time since Sterling's voice had echoed through that cabin above her, Evelyn Vance let herself believe she might actually win. The pounding came just before dawn, frantic against the front door. A different rhythm entirely from anything that had come before it. Evelyn heard it from her spot in the cellar, muffled through the floorboards, and felt the whole cabin above her jolt awake at once. Sterling's men stirred by the fire, grumbling, and she heard Caleb's footsteps cross quick toward the door. "Who's there?" Caleb called, wary, his voice pitched low enough that only those in the room would hear the strain in it. "Please," a man's voice, ragged, desperate, the accent carrying a cadence Evelyn didn't recognize. "My wife, the baby's coming wrong. She's bleeding. Please, we need help. Anyone, please." Caleb didn't hesitate. He threw the door open into the howling wind, and a man, half frozen, stumbled through, snow crusted thick on his shoulders, cradling a woman in his arms who Evelyn, listening from below, could hear moaning low and weak. "Gideon," Caleb barked. "It's a hote." Evelyn heard Gideon's footsteps cross the room fast. "What happened?" he said, and the warmth in his voice, even edged with urgency, told Evelyn this was someone he knew, someone he cared for. "Her labor started 2 days ago," Ahote said, his voice breaking. "Wrong. It's coming wrong. Gideon, she's bleeding too much." The midwife, back at camp, she said there's nothing more she can do. Said if anyone could help, it'd be the doctor up this mountain. "Lay her here," Caleb said, already moving, already thinking like a surgeon again. The panic in his own chest, visibly folding itself down into focus, by the fire. Now, above her, Evelyn heard Sterling's voice cut through the commotion, cold and disdainful. "You intend to treat that woman in this house." A pause. Evelyn could picture Caleb's face, could picture the fury he was working to keep contained. "She's dying," Caleb said. "Yes, I intend to treat her." "She's an Indian," Sterling said. Like that settled the matter entirely. "I didn't travel this far to share a roof with savages being tended like Christian folk. This is unseemly. This is my house," Caleb said, each word measured and hard as stone. "And in my house, a dying woman gets tended, whoever she is, whoever her people are. You're welcome to stand outside in the storm, if that offends your delicate sensibilities." Sterling said nothing further, though Evelyn could hear the disgust radiating off him, even through the floorboards. Could hear him settle back with his men near the far side of the room, refusing to help, refusing even to look, muttering something to his hired guns about savages and blood. Below, in the dark, Evelyn listened to Caleb's voice shift into something clipped and professional, calling for water, for clean cloths, for his bag of instruments. She heard the woman's moans grow weaker, more labored, and something in Evelyn's chest twisted painfully at the sound. Memory and empathy tangled together at once. She knew that sound. She'd heard women in the ward make that same sound, weak and fading, when no one came in time. "The baby's turned," Caleb said, his voice tight with concentration. "I need another set of hands, steady ones, and Levi's are already full holding the lamp. Gideon, I need you steady on her legs. But I need someone who can work close in, someone with small enough hands to help me turn this child." "There's no one else," Gideon said, and Evelyn heard the desperation in it, heard 3 grown men realizing all at once that between them, they lacked exactly what was needed. Evelyn's hand found the edge of the trapdoor above her before her mind had fully decided to move. She thought of Sterling upstairs. She thought of the notebook hidden beneath a floorboard in her own room, of every reason she had to stay hidden, safe, unseen, until the storm broke and the danger passed. Then she thought of the woman above her, dying by the fire, while a man who called himself a healer refused to lift a finger because of the color of her skin. She pushed the trapdoor open. The kitchen light hit her eyes hard after so long in darkness, and for a moment everyone in the room froze. Caleb's head snapping up from his work, Gideon's grip on the laboring woman's leg tightening in shock, Levi nearly dropping the lamp, and across the room, by the fire, where he'd settled to wait out the storm. Dr. Sterling rose slowly to his feet, his face breaking into a look of triumphant, cruel satisfaction. "There you are," he soft, almost fond, the way a man might greet a runaway dog he'd finally cornered. Evelyn didn't look at him. She climbed the rest of the way out of the cellar, crossed the kitchen floor in 3 fast strides, and knelt down beside Caleb without a word. Her eyes fixed only on the suffering woman in front of her. "Tell me what to do," she said. Caleb stared at her for one stunned second. And then, because there was no time left for anything but action, he nodded once and began issuing instructions, fast and precise. "Her hands are smaller than mine," he said, to no one and everyone. "I need her to reach in and help me guide the shoulder. Evelyn, wash your hands, quick, in that basin. Then come here." She did exactly as told, her hands shaking but steady enough, and Caleb guided her through it, his voice a constant, calm anchor even as the woman on the floor cried out in pain, even as blood soaked through the cloths beneath her. "Gentle," Caleb murmured. "Follow my hand. There, feel that. That's the shoulder. Caught up wrong. We need to turn it, just slightly, on my count." Evelyn's hands moved where he guided them, her own fear swallowed whole by the desperate need in front of her, by a stranger's life hanging on whether her hands did their job right in this single terrible moment. "Now," Caleb said, and together they turned the child, and the woman on the floor screamed once, sharp and final, and then the room filled with a different sound entirely, a thin, furious wail that meant life instead of death. Evelyn sat back on her heels, breathing hard, her hands trembling and slick, tears streaking down a face still pale with the strain of it, and watched as Caleb lifted a small, squalling infant into a clean cloth, checking him over with quick, practiced hands. "He's whole," Caleb said, relief cracking his voice wide open. "He's whole, and he's breathing, and he's furious about it, which is exactly what I want to hear." Ahote collapsed to his knees beside his wife, weeping, pressing his forehead to hers, and the two of them held their newborn son between them while the storm raged on outside, indifferent to the miracle that had just happened. Despite it, Evelyn looked up and found Sterling watching her across the room. His triumphant look faded now into something colder, something calculating. "You," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "You just risked capture. Risked everything for an Indian woman you've never met." "She was dying," Evelyn said. "I wasn't going to let that happen, because you decided her life mattered less than yours." "The girl I remember," Sterling said slowly, cowered in corners, flinched at raised voices. "Wouldn't so much as look a man in the eye. You are not her." "No," Evelyn said, rising slowly to her feet, her spine straighter than it had been in over a year. "I'm not her anymore. You made sure of that, locking me away, calling me broken, until I nearly believed you. But broken things don't turn shoulders in the dark to save a stranger's life. I'm not the girl you tortured, Sterling. I'm the woman she became in spite of you." Sterling's face twisted, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might lunge at her right then. Storm or no storm, witnesses or no witnesses. But Caleb rose slowly to his feet beside her, and Gideon and Levi flanked her other side. Three men forming a wall between her and the man who'd once held total power over her life. "The sun'll be up soon," Caleb said, his voice deceptively calm. "Storm's breaking by the look of the sky. I'd suggest you and your men get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day for everyone." Sterling said nothing, but the look he gave Evelyn, as he retreated back to his corner of the room, promised this was far from over. Dawn broke clear and blinding over a mountain buried in fresh snow, the storm having spent its fury sometime before sunrise, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt almost holy. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching the lights spread gold across the drifts, and felt the weight of what was coming settle over her like a second skin. Sterling knew now. There was no more hiding, no more pretending, no more root cellar to disappear into. Whatever came next would come out in the open, in daylight, in front of witnesses. And Evelyn found she was no longer afraid of that reckoning the way she once might have been. Ahote and his wife had left at first light, the new mother weak but stable, cradling her son against her chest, escorted partway down the mountain by Gideon to ensure they reached their camp safely. He returned just as Sterling and his men were finishing their own preparations to leave, the sheriff's man Boone looking deeply uneasy about the whole situation, sensing correctly that something ugly was about to unfold. Sterling stepped out onto the porch, flanked by his two hired guns, and fixed his eyes on Evelyn, standing between the three brothers. "I'll be taking her now," he said, addressing Caleb directly, as if Evelyn herself had no say in the matter at all. "I have legal documentation establishing my guardianship. Interfering with a lawful recovery is a serious offense. Show us the documents," Caleb said. Sterling produced a folded paper with a flourish, the ink official looking, the seal pressed deep into the wax. "Signed by a judge back east," he said. "This woman was committed under proper authority, following a diagnosis of severe hysteria and violent tendencies. She escaped confinement illegally. I am well within my rights to reclaim her. We don't own her," Caleb said, and something in his voice carried clear across the frozen yard. Steady and absolute. "We can't hand over what isn't property. She's not livestock that wandered off your land, Sterling. She's a person, and persons don't get handed over on the strength of a piece of paper alone. The law says otherwise," Sterling said. "Then let's discuss the law," Evelyn said, stepping forward before either brother could stop her, her voice ringing clear in the cold morning air. She held the black leather notebook in her hands, had carried it with her every step from her room that morning, knowing this moment was coming, knowing she'd need it the instant it arrived. "Sheriff Boone," she said, turning to the heavyset man standing uneasy near the horses. "I believe you were the one who guided these men up this mountain against your better judgment." Boone's eyes narrowed, wary but listening. "That's right. Then you should see what's inside this," Evelyn said, and tossed the notebook across the snow. It landed at Boone's feet, and he bent to retrieve it, opening the worn leather cover with visible reluctance. "This is a ledger," Evelyn said, "kept in Dr. Sterling's own hand, of every patient wrongfully committed to his facility over the past 6 years. Every family blackmailed into silence. Every dollar paid by relatives eager to be rid of an inconvenient daughter, wife, or sister. My uncle's payments are recorded there, too. Dated the same week I was declared unfit to inherit anything of my father's estate." Boone flipped through several pages, his face darkening with each one, and Sterling's composure finally cracked, his eyes going wide with fury. "That book is stolen property," Sterling snapped. "It proves nothing beyond a woman's talent for theft." "It proves everything," Boone said slowly, not looking up from the pages. "Names I recognize here. Sterling. Prominent families. This isn't hysteria talking. This is evidence of a crime." Sterling's calm shattered entirely. He lunged, not for the notebook, but for Evelyn herself, a knife appearing suddenly in his hand, drawn from somewhere beneath his coat, his face twisted with rage at watching everything he'd built collapse in front of him. Caleb, Gideon, and Levi moved as one, guns rising fast. But Evelyn was already moving too, faster than any of them expected. The months of lessons on that snowy ridge, paying out in a single decisive instant. She sidestepped Sterling's lunge, the knife slicing harmless through empty air where she'd stood a heartbeat before, and swung the rifle she'd carried at her side the entire morning in a hard, controlled arc, catching him across the side of the head with the heavy wooden stock. Sterling went down hard into the snow, the knife skittering away, his hired guns freezing in place at the sight of both brothers' pistols leveled steady at their chests. "Don't," Gideon said, low and final, and the two men raised their hands slow, wisely deciding this fight wasn't one worth dying for. Evelyn stood over Sterling, the rifle still raised, her chest heaving, and for one long moment, the entire yard held its breath, waiting to see what she'd do next. Sterling groaned, blood trickling from his temple, and looked up at her with something like fear finally breaking through the cruelty in his eyes. "Finish it," he rasped, almost daring her. "Prove I was right about you all along. Show them the violence I always said was in you." Evelyn lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately, until it pointed at the snow instead of at his skull. "No," she said, "I won't let your blood poison the land that gave me my life back. You don't get that from me. You don't get to be the reason I become something I'm not." She stepped back, and Boone moved forward instead, clamping heavy iron cuffs around Sterling's wrists with a grim satisfaction. "Theodore Sterling," Boone said, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and wrongful confinement, on evidence provided by this notebook. You'll be transported east to face federal charges the moment travel's possible." Sterling was hauled to his feet, blood still trickling down his face, and as they led him toward the horses, he cast one final look back at Evelyn, standing tall between three men who'd once been strangers and were now something far more permanent in her life. "You'll never truly belong anywhere," he spat, one last cruelty flung at her like a parting gift. "Three men sharing one broken woman. What kind of life is that?" "The kind I chose," Evelyn said, "which is more than you ever gave me the chance to do." They watched him dragged away down the mountain trail, his hired guns following under Boone's watchful escort, until the whole procession disappeared into the tree line and the yard fell quiet once more, snow settling soft and undisturbed in the wake of everything that had just happened. Caleb was the first to move, crossing the distance between them and pulling Evelyn into his arms, careful of her still healing ribs, but urgent all the same. "You could have been killed," he said into her hair, "charging at a man with a knife like that." "I wasn't charging," she said. "I was defending myself. There's a difference, and you taught me that difference the very first day I met you." Gideon and Levi joined the embrace, the four of them standing together in the trampled snow. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach weeks before, Evelyn Vance felt entirely, completely safe. Spring came to the mountain slow, the way it always did at that altitude, snow retreating in patches to reveal dark earth and stubborn green shoots pushing up through what remained of winter's grip. Evelyn stood on the porch one morning in early April, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the thaw work its way down the distant peaks. It had been nearly 3 months since Sterling had been hauled away in chains. 3 months of letters back and forth with lawyers and federal marshals. 3 months of slowly untangling the mess her uncle and Sterling had made of her life and her inheritance. The letter had arrived the day before, official and final. Sterling convicted on all counts, facing decades behind bars. Her uncle's assets frozen pending investigation into his role in the fraud. And most importantly, new identity papers confirming Evelyn Vance as a woman of sound mind, free and clear, with full legal claim to whatever remained of her father's estate. She was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely free. Free to leave, if she chose. Free to take that money and build a life anywhere in the country she wanted, unburdened by asylum records or guardianship papers, or any man's claim over her future. Caleb found her on the porch that morning, quiet, watching her think. "You've got that look," he said, "the one you get when you're working something out." "I got the letter yesterday," she said. "It's final, all of it. I'm free, Caleb. Truly free. For the first time since I was a girl." He nodded slow, and something careful crossed his face, something that looked almost like bracing for a blow. "What does that mean for you?" "It means I could leave," she said, "right now, if I wanted. Take the money. Go somewhere nobody's ever heard the name Evelyn Vance. Start over entirely new. Do you want that?" She considered the question honestly, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn over every decision now, weighing it against what she actually wanted, instead of what fear demanded of her. "A year ago," she said, "I'd have said yes without hesitation. Freedom meant distance, back then. Meant running as far from anyone who might hurt me as my legs could carry me." And now, Gideon and Levi had come out onto the porch as well, drawn by the quiet gravity of the conversation. And the three brothers stood together, watching her, making no move to sway her one way or the other, exactly as they'd done every single day since she'd arrived. That, she realized, standing there in the thin spring sunlight, was the answer itself. They weren't holding the door shut. They weren't begging her to stay. They stood there, open and unguarded, offering her the truth of their feelings without a single demand attached to it. "I don't need to run anymore," she said. "Not because there's nowhere left that could hurt me. There's always somewhere that could hurt me. But because I finally know what safety actually feels like. And I'm not interested in trading it for distance just because distance used to feel like the only kind of freedom available to me. She set her coffee down on the porch railing and walked back inside, returning a moment later with the original mail-order bride contract. The paper worn soft now from months of being carried and reread and considered. She crossed to the hearth, where a fire crackled low and steady, warming the room the same way it had every day since her first night on this mountain. I don't need a piece of paper to tell me where my home is, she said, and tossed the contract into the flames. It caught fast, curling black at the edges, the ink blurring and vanishing as the fire consumed the document that had first brought her to this mountain under false pretenses, replacing it with nothing but the plain truth of her own choosing. She turned back to the three men watching her from the doorway and found Caleb's eyes full of something unguarded and hopeful. Gideon's mouth curved in a small, satisfied smile. Levi's whole face open with the relief he didn't try to hide. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because a contract says I have to. Not because I've got nowhere else to go. I'm staying because somewhere between a locked door I chose to open and a rifle you put in my own hands and four walls built just to keep me safe from my own nightmares. I found something I never thought I'd have again." "And what's that?" Caleb asked, though something in his voice said he already knew. "A home," she said. "Not a house, not an arrangement. A home built by three men who never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I actually was." She crossed the room and walked straight into their arms, and the three brothers folded around her, careful and certain. Three different kinds of love that had, somehow, against every expectation, become one complete thing instead of three competing pieces. The following spring, the Thorn cabin bore a new sign nailed above its door, carved by Levi's own steady hands. It read simply, "Free clinic, all welcome." Word had spread quick through the territory of the mountain doctor and his family, of the healer, the protector, the architect, and the woman who stood beside them, no longer hiding, no longer afraid, treating every soul who came seeking help with the same fierce, unconditional care that had once saved her own life. Ahot's family visited often, his son growing strong and healthy, a living reminder of the night Evelyn had chosen courage over safety and found, in that choice, the first real proof of who she'd truly become. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned low, Evelyn would sometimes catch her own reflection in the window glass and no longer see the frightened, broken girl who'd stepped off a stagecoach into the mud a year before. She saw a woman who'd built something real out of the wreckage of everything that had tried to break her, standing exactly where she'd chosen to stand, surrounded by the family she'd chosen for herself, in the home that had chosen her right back. Every story we tell up here on this channel starts with a wound. And this one, more than most, was about what it actually takes to heal one. Evelyn Vance came to that mountain, broken in ways most people never have to survive, locked away by a family who wanted her silenced, bound so tight the marks never fully left her skin. And what she found in that cabin wasn't a rescue, in the way we usually think about rescue. Nobody swept in and fixed her. Nobody demanded she get better on anyone's timeline, but her own. What she found were three men who understood something a lot of real relationships still struggle with today. That love without consent isn't love. It's just a softer version of control. Think about that locked door Levi gave her the very first night. He didn't hand her a key to prove his trust. He handed her the only lock in the house and told her the brothers would never hold a key to it. Not ever. That's not a small detail in this story. That's the whole spine of it. Real safety isn't a promise someone makes with their words. It's a boundary someone else respects, even when nobody's watching, even when it costs them convenience, even when it would be so much easier to just walk in. And then there's Gideon out on that ridge, teaching her to shoot. He didn't just hand her a skill. He handed her back a piece of herself that had been taken away. Because here's a hard truth about protection. If the people protecting you are the only ones capable of defending you. That's not safety. That's dependence wearing a safety costume. Real love builds you up strong enough that you don't need saving next time. It puts the power back in your own two hands and says, "This is yours now. Keep it." Levi's sanctuary room might be my favorite piece of this whole story, honestly, because healing doesn't always look like a grand gesture. Sometimes it looks like a man spending 6 quiet nights alone with a hand plane, just so the woman he loves doesn't have to hear the wind and think it's screaming. That's what patience actually looks like in a relationship, not grand declarations. Small, repeated proof that someone is paying attention to what hurts you and is willing to do something slow and unglamorous about it. And then there's the moment Evelyn herself chooses to come out of hiding to help deliver Ahoti's baby, even with her abuser sitting 20 feet away. That's the turning point of the entire story, and it's worth sitting with. Healing was never about becoming fearless. It was about becoming someone who could act in spite of fear when something mattered enough. Courage was never the absence of Sterling's shadow over her life. It was choosing, in that one crucial moment, that another person's life mattered more than her own safety in that instant. By the time she throws that marriage contract into the fire, she's not choosing these men because a piece of paper told her to. She's choosing them because somewhere between a locked door, a rifle, and 4 soundproofed walls, she learned what safety actually feels like when it comes without conditions attached. So if there's one thing worth carrying out of this story with you, let it be this. Love isn't about rescuing someone from who they are. It's about giving them room to become who they were always capable of being, on their own terms, at their own pace, with the door locked exactly as tight as they need it to be, for exactly as long as they need it locked. If this story moved you even a little, drop a comment telling me which brother's love language hit you hardest: Caleb's healing, Gideon's empowerment, or Levi's safety. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, because we've got a lot more mountains left to climb together. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.